as well. My name is Chris Sadler. I'm the Director of Human Resources for the Sun Prairie Area School District. Just a little background on me: as I grew up in Heartland, Wisconsin, I started my education career teaching kindergarten for 10 years. Graduated from UW-Madison in 1998 when I moved down to Atlanta. Worked for 6 years in a kindergarten teaching role in a large school district, one of the largest in the country, the Gwinnett County public school system outside of Atlanta. I was one of 17 kindergarten teachers on the grade level. Lots of learning over those 6 years, obviously, with that many teachers that I could learn from and work with. After teaching in Atlanta, I moved back up to Wisconsin, to central Wisconsin in the Wisconsin Rapids area. I was a kindergarten or a 4K teacher in the Adams Friendship School District for a year, and then I taught in Nakusa as kindergarten teacher, and I was lucky enough to then become principal in Nakusa at Humke Elementary there for a few years, and then I moved to Marshall, Wisconsin, and personally moved to Sun Prairie with my family, but was principal at the Marshall Early Learning Center for 5 years. After that, I was lucky enough to become principal of C.H. Bird in Sun Prairie in the community I live in. And then in 2018, I began my career here as a Director of Human Resources for the last 2 years in the growing district of Sun Prairie. So let's first look at handbooks, just the basics of handbooks. Now, this is not the most exciting point that you'll learn about in administration, but these can be a real backbone to how you make decisions, how you handle very different situations, and sometimes a handbook you can lean back on to help you make those decisions and be consistent with what the district is expecting you to do. Handbooks should be and are consistently reviewed and revised. Outside agencies can do the work. Neola, which is a group that helps with policies, handbooks, many other things. But you should be really working with your attorney to look at your handbook for any legal updates you may not be aware of on a yearly basis. Most districts do not do this, but it is really important. And I will say, in my own position as Human Resources Director, there are many times where I find a handbook point or policy is very out of date and actually hurts the employer, and sometimes actually hurts the employee because it's not updated. So you got to be really thoughtful with handbooks. Again, they're not the most exciting topic in the world, but they can really make or break a decision and can cause you to actually be efficient with your time or really inefficient with your time if it's not updated. Typically, when you want to update a handbook from a committee level, the recommendation should come from a small representative group of each work group for feedback when revising a handbook. I highly discourage large groups of people, like sending out the handbook to everybody and saying, what would you like to change? Because typically you're going to get a wide variety of themes and topics, and you won't be able to really focus on what you're trying to do. Or you can have multiple committees focused on each specific work group, especially between exempt and non-exempt employees. And the reason I say the difference between salaried and hourly, there's a lot of different laws that govern both of those types of employees. And to kind of get a better sense for that, you can check out the Fair Labor Standards Act information that's linked into this presentation or in resources. What I find is a lot of the times people don't understand that there is a main difference between being salaried and hourly, especially with expectations around work, overtime, or not overtime. There's so many pieces in there. So make sure when you're writing handbooks, they are either specific to those groups or create one handbook where each type is kind of delineated throughout it and saying this is for salaried employees, this is for hourly employees. Typically, after a revision or recommendation is made, after the committee work, recommendation is then made to the school board, who approves that change. Now, each district kind of has a different process for that. You might want to talk with your cooperating administrator to understand your specific one in your district, but typically the recommendation then goes to the school board for a vote. After it's voted on and approved, or if it's not approved, you communicate any changes to the employee group when it's revised and or approved. That's just good practice. So you work with the committee, find common ground around that handbook that makes sense, provide a recommendation to the board, have it voted on, and then communicate back to the group on what actually was the outcome. So looking at handbooks more, around the basics continued. How does a handbook change happen? So basically minor changes can be done in consultation and communication with human resources superintendent or superintendent, and just keeping the board apprised of that. And when I say minor changes, that's typically like grammatical things or really basic changes to organization, things that aren't going to affect benefits or compensation. Those types of things are the ones you have to get board approval on. If it's more of a simple change in schedule or whatever it might be, you work with the employee group and then just kind of change it from there. And like I said, compensation and benefits are typically need board approval when you're going through this. So again, this might be named differently in different districts, but typically whoever is looking to change handbook language, and typically that's somebody in human resources, but not all districts have like a human resources representative. So it may be a business manager, maybe a superintendent, maybe a director of instruction or special ed. It could be a whole variety of people writing handbook changes. So that person typically writes a school board situation report, which details the change to be delivered to the school board prior to the meeting. Typically, it needs to have a board vote at the board meeting once they read the situation report. Now, a situation report is basically just a report that we'll talk about in a second that gives the board some information around the change and why the change is being recommended. One thing that I find with handbooks is if you have a suggestion for your employee group or just generally, do not be afraid to speak up, because most of the time what I find is that handbooks don't get annual revisions or annual reflections or looks at. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, probably nobody's picked up on it yet. And if you can just say it, that can be changed relatively quickly, especially if it's glaring. So what is a situation report? It sounds very official, which it is, but it goes to the school board. It's a report to the school board giving information regarding a possible policy change, handbook change, procedural change, and basically anything the board will need to make a decision to vote on. Included in the situation report typically is a history and background to why the change, or what's happened before this and why the change is needed now, which does then lend itself into the description of reasons behind a need for the change, if it's applicable. Typically, the situation report also has attachment of handbook changes needed or presentation of data. And that could be a simple, here's the old language, here's the new language. And you can look at some examples in resources that I wrote up on a couple different situation reports, and you can kind of see how I'm showing them what handbook language used to be and what we're recommending. And then also typically that change might come with a board presentation of some sort. So if you do a slideshow of some sort and you present that to the board verbally so the community can hear it as well, that presentation is included in the situation report too, so they can refer to that as you're speaking at a board meeting. And then at the end of the situation report, it's usually a 1 or 2 sentence specific request for what you want done, saying we recommend for the school board to approve ... You're asking for a specific action to be done from the school board, and typically that's an approval of whatever you've presented in the situation report. And again, take a look in the resources, look at some of those situation reports, talk with your CA about what your local school board expects, and it might not even be named situation report there, but it could be named something else like board report, whatever it might be. Okay, so it's really important to understand what's the difference between policy, administrative guidelines, and statute and law. So this is really basic look at it, but it kind of gives you a sense for it. Policies are rules made by school boards to achieve the goals of the school district and to function effectively and efficiently. They're typically focused on conduct and the operations of the school district. Guidelines are recommendations on how best to comply with law, policy, or regulation. These are things so there's policy, and as an administrator, you really got to follow that policy consistently. Guidelines provide you the flexibility to understand what the school board or what the district expects from you when you're dealing with some type of decision as an administrator. But it's guidelines, so you're supposed to work within those guidelines. It might not be consistent. And this kind of goes with the quote It depends, because a lot of the times in your administrative roles, there's going to be a lot of different situations, and it all depends on a whole bunch of different variables that deal with that certain situation, and those guidelines kind of help give you fences to work within. And then finally, the state statutes or laws, they supersede all policies and guidelines. So basically, if there is a state statute or law, you have got to follow that, and that supersedes any type of policy or guideline that's in your board policy handbook or guidelines that you've written. One thing that you can do is I want you to talk with your cooperating administrator about the idea of using board policies or administrative guidelines to resolve ethical dilemmas. A lot of the times when a dilemma comes your way or some type of conflict comes your way as an administrator, the first thing you try to do is your mindset sometimes is, I got to fix this situation, or I got to help fix this situation. Sometimes you have a policy or administrative guideline that will guide you in that immediately. And you don't have to do a lot of decision making. It could just be, this is our policy, this is what we have to do, or this is the guideline that I have to follow through on, and this is how we're going to handle it. It allows for a lot more efficient way of going through something that's an ethical dilemma or a conflict of some sort. There are different ways that you can access like your policies and administrative guidelines. Now in Sun Prairie, we have something called Board Docs, which is just an online board policy book, basically. And you click in there, I can type a search and find out what policy I'm trying to deal with social media or discipline or non-renewal. It's all in there, and I can find it when I'm trying to handle a situation. Things that I want you to discuss with your cooperating administrator is, where do you find your district policies and administrative guidelines? How often does your district review their policies? And what would be your plan as a building or district leader using these types of board docs or policies or administrative guidelines to make decisions? And I would ask your cooperating administrator how they've used them in the past. So again, leveraging board policy to resolve conflict. What's important about policies is they do create consistency. They can take the burden off you as a school leader, which means that you might feel like you're in the middle of having to make a decision when there might be a policy that says this is what you have to do. And you can lean on that and talk to the people involved and say, this is our policy, so we have got to follow it. Policies are meant to be used. A lot of the times, as an administrator, you're not going to know all your policies. So that's why you have to work with other administrators or do some digging into your own policies to find out if there is a policy that deals with whatever it is you're trying to work through. Because a lot of the time school leaders often forget to consult policies. And that's where I find that typically somebody will make a mistake as a school leader, is that there's a policy that's right there, but they kind of go off that track because they don't know what's there. And they make a decision that actually goes against policy, and they're kind of rebuffed later, which can undercut their leadership a bit. So you always want to make sure that you look for a policy first and dig and see if there is something there. What I would say is that as you lean on policies, be on the look for policies that may be creating other issues. Just like handbooks, sometimes policies are not looked at as much as they should be. And there may be policies from the past that are now creating issues now that could easily have a tweak or a revision and change the whole outcome of how a district is working. A quote that I always hear from a few of my leaders that I've worked with is that typically procedures are perfectly created, unintentionally or intentionally, to get the results they get. So if you're seeing a consistent, maybe negative outcome that your district is constantly churning out, there may be a policy that's created that the intention was good, but now it's having these unintentional consequences that are constantly being created. And what I say by perfectly created, it doesn't mean that somebody meant to make them to do that, but now they're perfectly creating these outcomes over and over and over again. So if you come up against a policy that doesn't make sense and it seems like it's actually leading to negative, unintentional consequences, you're going to want to bring that up and really talk about that with your administrative team. So there's a case on the next slide that I just want you to think through your own policies and rules if you can find them. Just think about the case. What would your next steps be based on your policies? So this is just a thought exercise that I want you to think through. I'm going to read it to you. I know it's on the slide, but I want to make sure that I can read it and then talk through the questions. And I just want you to think through um, from a point of really thinking through an ethical dilemma that you could easily be put in front of, which I think some of you that are looking as superintendents or any type of school leadership probably have gone through this at some point. Maybe not at this level, though. So the superintendent of a 10,000 student school district has just learned that the state will deficit fund the district approximately 10% for the following year due to a poor economy, resulting in a significant shortfall of tax revenue. This revenue shortfall amounts to a huge financial hit on basic district operations. In order to balance the district budget and maintain the state mandated budget reserve, the superintendent will need to either reduce both classified and certified staff or reduce their salaries and benefits. Earlier that year, there was a provision in the newly developed strategic plan that class size will be maintained at a maximum of 28 students per class, and employee salaries and benefits will remain competitive with surrounding school districts. Which alternative should the superintendent recommend to the school board? Reduce staff salaries and benefits for all staff through furlough days, or increase the class size to 30 students, resulting in the layoff of 24 teachers? How would you assess either recommendation made by the superintendent, as it will have an enormous impact on the perceptions of fairness of his or her leadership with the teachers, parents, and community? And then what policies would you lean on when making a decision or creating a plan? So again, I'm going to go back to question 1, just because I think this is obviously the decision to make. Reduce staff salaries and benefits, or increase the class size to 30 students. Both of these kind of have gone against things that were decided earlier in the year from what it sounded like. But now you have to make some type of decision to allow your district to continue to run, and knowing that you'll be questioned on that since you may have promised things in the beginning of the year. So something that I'm sure that you probably came to when you were thinking through that scenario is that sometimes there is no right answer. There are only reasonable and grounded strategies. And what I mean by that is that you have to look at your strategic plan and your policies and just ground yourself in that. It may not be popular, but it is reasonable, and you have an explanation of why. Wherever possible, provide goals along the way to determine if strategies are having the desired effect. So when you make a big decision like that, make sure you have some type of small goals set in a timeline that will allow you to report back to people to say that the decision that you made, popular or not, had the desired effect that you were looking for. And then right in the middle of this is all about transparency and making sure that as you go through these decisions, especially in like a dilemma like the one that was read, always be as transparent as possible. Obviously, you can't give out confidential information, but where you can possibly help people understand your thinking and where you are as a district or a leadership group, the better, the more informed they are, and the more they feel they can trust you. Even if that transparency means that you're providing them with maybe not so good news as you go through it, but at least you're being upfront and honest with them about something that's going wrong. If it is going the wrong direction, it is okay to stop and refine. So when you make those big decisions, you're going to have people that think they're wrong. But if you go through a reasonable process and realize eventually that your decision maybe wasn't the best one, it is good to stop and say, we've rethought it, and now we have to go in this direction. Because again, in their heart of hearts, most people don't expect you to get everything right. But they do expect you to be transparent and know when something isn't going the right direction, and to take some type of action to change that and switch it. And then just remember the whole time that input is not the same as shared decision making. And there are many times where shared decision making may not be the right strategy. So when you ask for input, really make sure you're clear to people saying that this is truly input. That you will help make the best decision. It does not mean that you're going to agree with the input, but you need to know those perspectives and be clear with those people that are giving it that you're looking at it and are listening to their input, but that doesn't mean that it might go that direction. And then the other part is there may be times where shared decision making just is not the best strategy because you have to move quickly, and it may sometimes be like an emergency um, type of decision that has to be made of some sort, especially around safety, that you're not going to have time to look for input. So you have to gauge when those decisions are and make that decision, but still have a why behind it, knowing that people will question it after the fact. And if you can really ground yourself again in a reasonable why, people may not agree, but they'll understand where you came from. One link that's on this slide that might be interesting for you to read is something called A Wicked Problem. It's just an interesting reading because it reminds me of where we are right now, especially with COVID and pandemics, is that some of these ethical dilemmas have no real right answer. And this article just talks about how to kind of go through a problem like that. And a professor in this case called it a wicked problem because in the end, you don't know what the right answer is, and you're just doing your best to make educated guesses along the way to come up with a solution that may be the best of a worst case scenario. So interesting reading. So really quickly, I'm going to explain the assignment, coming up with ethical dilemmas. I know that you've gotten a slideshow before just explaining it, but you're going to get a dilemma based on your certification area. And what we're looking for is just a response that includes how you look at solving the dilemma, the specific policies you would use to help you make decisions, the procedures and or state statutes used to guide the decision, and how you would pull in different perspectives to make sure your decision is the best it is for the community and the school you serve. And then you just provide a reflective commentary on the impact of the decision on affected stakeholders. What does that mean is basically it's saying that you know your decision is going to have this effect on students, this effect on parents, this effect on teachers or admin or your colleagues, and talk about how you would mitigate anything that may be negative for those people, and think through that in a reflective way. So here are the scenarios. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can use this, or it's in your syllabus as well. But there is one for principals or director of special education and pupil services at the top. Director of instruction is the second one. Superintendent is the third one, and then business manager is the fourth. And these don't give all the information in the world, and that's okay. It's just to kind of give you a sense for what the dilemma is all about. And if you have to add details here or there to make it a little simpler to justify your solution and your strategies, that's okay. But these are just the basis for that. So for the rubric for assignment number 4, as you can see, it goes from 1, 2, 3, and 4. But really, I'm just going to talk about 3 as the effective evaluation of an assignment would include a clear understanding of the dilemma as well as a response, detailed explanation of the process used to solve the dilemma, as well as policies and state statutes that are connected to that. I think that what you're going to want to do if you're going to move from a 3 to a 4 is really to show the different perspectives you use and how you included that to make the decision you did or the solution that you ended up creating. All right, so you've reached the end of this module. Please contact me if you have any questions, and thank you, and thanks for your time.